graduated from the Städel in Frankfurt and has taught at Harvard, at Rhode Island School of Design, at Cooper Union, and at UCLA since 1989, where she's currently an associate professor of architecture. One of the things that I think distinguishes Dagmar's practice is the emphasis on the transformation of theoretical projects, specifically the way in which she has tried to theoretically, in a sense, construct a practice and to develop an architecture based on the whole territory of consumable objects, so that she really becomes much more involved with day-to-day relationship of architecture and sites, and really addressing architecture as a consumable object. She has, apart from her many competitions and writings, has exhibited her work at Storefront for Architecture in New York, in Denmark, and has been involved with many theoretical and experimental projects. There is a book, I gather, underway by Princeton Architectural Press on some of her work. And she is a prize winner in the Royal Library competition in Copenhagen, and the winner of the Shinkanchiku membrane, the so-called light construction competition that was announced a while back. Most recently, she's worked on the competition for city structures in Shanghai, which is one of the projects that we're going to see tonight, as well as the contribution that she's made to the book of Francesca Hughes on issues of feminism, which again is part of a symposium here later on this month. So would you please join me in welcoming Dagmar Richter. Thank you.
Welcome. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here. I have actually only been crawling around in these halls many years as a student. Always very, I would say, depressed about the amount of work which is produced in the AA. I was always very interested in this school specifically because there was a rather important and interesting dialogue going on, where I was kind of more used to monologues where I was going, besides maybe the latest time at the Städel, where finally we actually were more or less run like the AA, since Peter Cook was running it. I'm working relatively slow. That has a lot to do that I refuse a commercial practice, and since I refuse a commercial practice, I don't have the money to hire a lot of assistants. So I do most of my drawings myself, or have very small groups. The work which I'm presenting were actually mostly produced by me and my friends, and sometimes some of my students. So I've never really had a real recognizable practice. We were trying to construct a practice, I guess, and this idea of constructing a practice was more and more clarified through the book, which now came out by Francesca Hughes. She's the editor, and she asked, I don't know, about 10, 12 women around the world that they should kind of say something about this. The unfortunate situation about this book is that it took a very long time. So most of the articles which are in there are at least 4 years old, which nowadays is very old, I guess. So, you know, but I still think that it's actually a very, very interesting book, and I guess since you have a meeting about this, it would be interesting to see, because there are all these different forms of practices represented in it, and different kind of constructs. Anyway, we constantly struggled since we started to construct this practice under the impression that architecture as we knew it had actually soundlessly vanished. And I would maybe say that specifically in the United States. The discipline's task to produce high culture was suddenly regarded actually as utterly unimportant by the public at large. Commissions representing the higher goals of society gave way to an overall demand for bottom line economics and efficiency. That's normally the point it's normally the point in time where a lot of women enter the disciplines in vast numbers. The amount of women entering a discipline normally is directly related to the amount of power which is regarded that discipline is going to have in society. So the idea of potency in architecture, be it culturally as well as socially or financially, started to receive giggles. A reinvestment in the design process started to happen, and it had to happen because the aspirations which we were taught architecture had to have seemed to be rather unrealistic. The main question, I guess, which we constantly remained asking us was how to produce architecture in a more theoretical framework, and also in theoretical frameworks which seem to be rather important to us all, without investing yet or investigating into yet another look. As you probably know, we've seen a steady flow of looks by now, which supposedly were to reflect theory and resistance to mass cultural demands, but in actuality created a constant flow of consumable formal novelties. That does not mean that theory itself was to blame. The problem seems to lie much more in the forms created which were to reflect or rather illustrate the new theory. The forms did very much other than what they actually promised. They created fashion independently of their claims, and they could not help it, even if they wanted to. We decided then, let us create fashion then, without the false claims of resistance, at least without the false claims of resistance represented in form. Resistance needed to be much more applied to the social orders architecture is still assumed to create. As a bunch of so-called newly constituted subjects, as women as well as men who grew up in a different cultural framework, what gender roles are concerned, we all started to be part of the game, and we had an urge of authorship. We wanted to propose space, and we wanted to investigate possible techniques, and we wanted to propose form, but we did not want to produce form which was recognized as style. And we didn't want to produce form which automatically would have to stand for the techniques utilized. So what was important to us was to gain an idea of how to produce form, realizing how deeply we were already embedded in the existing system of cultural politics. So the work coming from my studio started to be more and more influenced by theoretical feminist literary theory. Copy as an art and as a technique suddenly took away the constant pressure to invent new form for fast consumption. Theories of translation and translational resistance, which we gained knowledge of through the theoretical feminists, became a starting point of production. We all were out there. By now, we were all in the margins. Since the 70s, there have been a lot of different groups who existed within the postmodern discussion, which used some of the critical texts of the post-structuralists in order to analyze politically the role of the author in the process of cultural production. Julia Kristeva, for example, or Sisu, were writing a lot on the author and subject. A wide gap started to occur between France and the United States, though. And I think it had to do that in the West, in the United States, cultural revolution started because there were quite a number of diverse minority representatives which started to subvert the found theory and art criticism, much more than in a centralized European setting, in a central European setting like Germany and France, where society still was relatively centered around a more kind of cleaner race picture. 3 groups in the United States, I guess, which again all consist of a lot of different subgroups, became a reference point in many of our discussions. One group worked through the cultural definition of racial minorities and their possibilities to produce a culture which reflects their particular experiences. One group redefines the assumed framework of the heterosexual author from a homosexual perspective. The third group, which influenced us, I guess, the most, was representing a very small fraction of postmodern feminists who work theoretically with the criticism of modern culture and practically, and that was the important part for us, with the constitution and production of postmodern culture and its author definition. So we started to essentially try to rethink a possible so-called writing process, which reflects female existence, or rather, as it was called in France, the écriture féminine. A closer look at the possibilities of producing culture for women made it clear that there were many obstacles then, 10 years ago, to overcome. But as women started to enter the different fields, and not only women, a lot of so-called marginalized groups started to enter the fields, and as it was made possible for all these people to produce, it became painfully clear that the given precedences of cultural production were for many people deeply tainted, and they did not necessarily provide a useful framework of reference for the newly awakened author. We became aware that we were often uninterested in certain architectural spaces which we're supposed to admire. It was also clear it became more and more difficult to follow many of the intellectual leaders in the field, since often their importance seemed more to be measured by their willingness to defend their authority position through rigorously aggressive turf wars. The attempt to proclaim strong authorship prevailed even if that specific person proposed weak architecture. Our lack of enthusiasm was sometimes regarded as a lack of talent or knowledge, or rather lack of sophistication. But actually, I think it was due to lack of interest. How to formulate a framework then for a cultural production where wide circles of society suddenly transform from object of desire and representation to subject and author, and where up to now the one who described, dedicated, named, conquered, produced, represented was always supposedly a Western heterosexual male. The important part there is that we assume that this fact has changed. For example, Rosemary Tong defined in her book Feminist Thought 8 basic feminist movements. According to her, the French feminists or theoretical feminists started to work on the modern project and the concept of the avant-garde by analyzing many of their fathers. They also became quickly interested in the ideology of the post-structural cultural criticism. They probably had the most ambivalent relationship to the biologically determined feminism. For them, women didn't mean feminism. Feminism was a much more theoretical framework under which they worked, which had to do with the constitution of authorship per se, not in case if it was biologically defined by women or not. So at first, the analytical phase of many theoretical feminists helped to reveal gaps, myths, inconsistencies in the cultural production which were meant to clear a path. The feminist cultural criticism, which runs parallel to a more economical or political discussion, described in the most disciplined way the rules of cultural production as a political phenomenon. In that sense, the production of culture became political. And it was then insisted that poetry has to be politicized. Any author in this discourse is deprived of his privilege of neutrality and objectivity. Cultural production was revealed as always having the agenda of dominance. The question, therefore, became much more embracing and complex, as the entire production of culture and its artifacts were now suddenly involved. And so in this practice of our studio, their more theoretical studies on literature seemed to be more relevant in case we wanted to produce form, more relevant in the production side of things than in certainly also the theoretical side. But the theory was always only used as a base for production and not as a base of writing. we started to investigate the possibility to write, being defined as a marginalized subject from the beginning, to produce a first attempt in partial or fractured narratives of opposition, taking into account that the production of difference can quickly slip into the production of indifference. Our work started with a rather banal question, which was certainly much more eloquently posed by the theoreticians. How actually does one now propose the good when the definition of rationality and morale has become so problematic? And the cultural authority to select and propose based on one's personal experience and will to aggression was more and more diminishing. We became more interested which relationship we will establish as authors towards the given precedents at large and how we can utilize them. So the established authority to propose space based on one's communication with the female muses is diminishing for everybody. And we have to reassess the enlightened modernist legacy. None of the efforts by some architects who either deny that architecture is involved in their production at all, or that no author but merely a process or the computer is involved in the purely coincidental architectural construct, helped us at this point to disguise the crisis of what we thought intelligentsia in architecture was going through. In the first case, the denial of the architecture even taking place, I will take a proposal like John Jardy. I mean, I'm very LA based, so those people play a large role. John Jardy, for example, started to insist that no architecture is involved in his huge mall proposals. I'm sure you are familiar with them. The outcome was that clients seemed much more willing to engage into his ideas. Building was made less threatening. As buildings went up, it was certainly very apparent that what cultural effect the mall structures had in the inner city. The use of the public space and daily life of the consumers were entirely changed. The architect then, afterwards, was recognized as author and creator and was called back by many clients ever since. He has a rather large and very successful practice, specifically recognized as author of those malls, which at the same time in any lecture he denies has anything to do with architecture per se at all. The second attempt, which everybody is rather aware of, was the attempt that there is no subject at all anymore, but only the self-reflexibility of the text per se. This proposal was tried by some authors, as you know, Rob Grillet, as well as architects like Peter Eisenman. These authors then tried to use auto-representation, discontinuity, and rupture during the production of their texts or designs as they tried to deny any universal truth as unachievable to be represented. From this conviction, a cultural production emerged which used a by-chance encounter, be it text, a sewing machine, a gene structure, or geometrical pattern, to start a process where its only raison d'etre was then an elaboration of its logical process. The problem was then later discussed at length by some feminist theoretician. Nancy Hartstock, for example, asked, why is it just at the moment in Western history when previously silenced populations have begun to speak for themselves and on behalf of their subjectivities that the concept of the subject and the possibility of discovering and creating a liberating truth has become suspect? In the discipline of architecture, those elaborate by chance processes did produce consistently complicated formal consumable novelty, which deeply embeds architecture into the modern ideology of the avant-garde, as well as still is dependent on the myth of a neutralized rationality of a process as a highly valued base for an argument for its formal outcome. On a side note, it seemed rather contradictory and enlightening to see the authors who declared the author as dead celebrated as one of the most prominent authors with blurbs in every popular magazine in the US and rock concert-style lectures here and elsewhere. All in all, the already established conservative cultural politics worked extremely well under the new theoretical regime, independently of the claims and wishes of the respective authors involved. With that, I want to make clear, I'm not accusing the author, him or herself. I'm accusing, or I'm just trying to analyze what systematically actually happens and how society still insists on strong authorships in the sense to be able to consume the novelties which are given to them. The architectural designer describes a named space in the form of representation. In this sense, the theoretical designer or the student, the office employee, does not distinguish him or herself from the building architect. In cultural politics, it's only important who in the process can pull the right of signature into his court, an act which is established and defended by the normally already privileged individual. To build the represented spaces, to actually erect it, as Sissou described it, is an active act of reading and translation, and by many. Architectural design is, I would like to propose, always defined by its translationability in order to be recognized as architecture. As the work is given to the next involved party, the first act of translation will have to be applied in order for it to become built architecture. This act works transformative, as already Walter Benjamin described in his theory on text and writing. To build architecture means then to participate in the transformative process of a translation into a physical reality, which at the same time is permanently in fluid. The architect produces a text in a form of a representation which is defined by its translationability. This is a precondition which distinguishes the architectural representation, be it drawing, model, computer simulation, or other, from any other normal work of art, specifically between that and the work of painting and sculpture. To translate is described by Walter Benjamin as an act of above naming. It's called Überbenennung. Theoretical feminists were very interested in the concept of translation when they studied the possibility of textual production today. At this point in time, some of them insisted only a translation of the existing cultural text into a more embracing language is possible. Resistive translation was proposed as one of the most effective techniques in order to produce another text. To design an architecture is to actively translate found spatial constructs. In a fluid field of changes, the planner and designer is an active reader of the appropriated text, which then gets translated to contemporary conditions. The participants are all involved in the discourse of intentions and ideals, which then will be conveyed in various forms of representations to different readers. The readers can at the same time not be regarded as passive entities consuming the text in an unaltered form. Every reading will leave new traces of translational transformations on the text. The produced text is never objective, never clean, never original in the classical sense. Single authorship in architecture is an oxymoron. The produced representations are there in order to be appropriated by politicians, developers, architects, planners, builders, owners, but also by critics, historians, and other academics who need to consume the representations to create further readings. The tripartite consortium of producer, critic, and user, with an inherent and distinct role for each as an inventor, creator, critical appropriator, and passive consumer, has been blurred for many years. All of them who are involved can be seen as producers, consumers alike. At this point, it is important to include other sets of information into the transformative reading process, which have not been recognized up to now as an active cultural text to be integrated. In that sense, copy and originality becomes rather interesting, specifically since we're now getting into new phases where, for example, Rem Koolhaas gets accused of copying. Instead of following the classical idea that the act of designing and assigning is defined by a process of invention, one has to regard oneself as an editing specialist who critically initiates choice through a process of interpretation in the act of translation of already assembled material. As there have been many voices which were not read through history as we know it, since they have either been deemed inappropriate, irrelevant, or undesirable, it is now necessary to apply thorough criticisms towards the selection of representations considered as relevant to one's reading process. For example, Donna Haraway, a theoretician in terms of cyberspace, writes that an inevitable framework of her writing is like the following. The tools are often stories, retold stories, versions that reverse and displace the hierarchical dualisms of naturalized identities. In retelling origin stories, cyborg authors subvert the central myth of the origin of Western culture. And with that in mind, I'm trying to show you some projects where I will try to find a certain kind of frameworks, how we theoretically have started to design. The first one is called Designing as a Cultural Commentary. And I don't know if I have to push on or... That's not the first. Sorry. Can I just go to the first picture myself? All right. The first idea of designing has to do that the author, normally inspired by female muses, inserts high culture onto the site. The site is always regarded as negative, passive, or normally as a kind of vessel, which had gotten a lot of theoretical description, as you probably know. And that the site, for example, in itself has never been regarded as some kind of cultural text already on which one describes on a theoretical modern basis a second layer. So here, for example, about 10 years ago, the idea that one had to design public... I know what's going on there. Why is this automatically going forward?
Is it?
Yes. It may have the timer on. No, it's still. It's about there, I guess. Yeah. We started to investigate the possibility of copy, which means that the so-called first cultural base of form making was the information of the site itself. It was a kind of an idea in order to not have to invent some formal novelties, but try to find some kind of formal information which the site itself could give. It was in a framework of the West Coast Gateway competition. I worked with a friend of mine, Shane O'Neill, and we decided to kind of read the layers of the site, whatever we could find, or the different types of representations, and kind of collapse them on top of each other and try a new design process after we have more or less gained knowledge of all those different kind of formal conditions. The site was regarded as a kind of tabula rasa, as is a typical modern myth, which you can see to the left. It was a huge highway, and it was about the air rights. See if this one works now. The outcome were two rather different models, which were produced within about a distance of several months. But the interesting part about these two models were that these different layers of spatial informations which we got were collapsed back onto some kind of scaffolding and then left as some kind of halfway transparent public space with different kinds of layers where all of these different layers were assigned some specific quality. We used it as a way of nearly looking at it to find precedences which were at that point not tainted. It was the first attempt to find a so-called untainted precedence condition. The outcome were all these layers which in themselves had like assigned conditions like water, earth, hard surface, volumes, and were all had a very precise technical relationship to each other. When we finished this one, we started to find out that not only that the precedences were some kind of difficult situation to work with, but we started to be interested in something which the theoretical feminists have called a project speaking in a chorus. They went from like the classical Greek chorus in a theater piece as a kind of a commentary or a kind of an overall text which was to be produced as a kind of common good. And so use this one project, Century City, which I only wanted to kind of tell you some very short examples of how this situation could be working. The representation of the site and why centricity certainly happened was that it was, again, as you can see to the left, regarded as an entire tabula rasa situation. It was cleared of any trace of any kind of identity so that it could be hygiene, a kind of a condition of hygiene and neutralization. Where when you look at the right, the existence, the physical existence of the site could be read in a very different way. You had Paris and Baghdad and suburbia and oil fields more or less at the same time on the site, which all had to be cleared in order to make this modernist legacy, which we can see now, which is a typical kind of skyscraper production with grand distances for car traffic, in itself regarded as a large machine. If you looked at other conditions, we had a whole group of people who everybody of them started to read the surfaces of anything they could find. So, for example, the left person, or there were several persons involved, as a chorus started to read what types of traces the site actually had to offer them, where the right person decided to see what the surfaces of the real existence of the site actually had to offer them. So the surfaces of the skyscrapers as they were seen were directly used as a precedent, as a transformational or translational kind of process. You can see to the right how some kind of the photographs started to be turned into small working models, where the left started to give another author some kind of structural framework under which this one was going to happen. Surface and structure, logic and beauty were kind of often interlocked or also exchanged. So to the right there was a so-called structural drawing where all the different structures found were further and further developed in some kind of reading and a text drawing, where to the left some of the surface representations some of the authors have used were then further translated in some kind of models. In this experiment, which again was a situation where we tried to find out how you could actually produce, where the layers were permanently exchanged, some kind of structure which in itself then would not necessarily have the kind of preconceived categorization. For example, preconceived categorization, object versus landscape, surface versus line, typological conditions of, for example, the skyscraper in this kind of tabula rasa, clean condition, but where objects, surfaces, lines, and those kinds of conditions were suddenly starting to melt, and we were rather surprised what kind of formal conditions we came out with. It is clear that this was a formal exercise. We did not want to build it. We were not trying to be good social citizens. We had some ideas about the skyscraper and its verticality, the certain kinds of logics and ideologies which were regarded with it, but at the same time we wanted to find out if a different process of making at that point could find a difference in form. That was many years ago, but the outcome of those kinds of models were actually something which made a great impression on us, in what sense we could use different kinds of techniques to form or to produce. The other theories which we started to be very interested in were that the feminists started to talk about laughter and hysterical laughter, and about history or being hysterical as being actually an aesthetic choice instead of being a clinical condition. For example, in The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco describes a monastery with an imposing fortress-like setting where the library is laid out like a labyrinth, and it becomes a death trap for all monks who approach a certain book, read it, and while turning the poised pages, poison themselves. The fatal reading is the second part of Aristotle's Poetics, which was believed to have been lost, a comedy which was forbidden to read because it taught about laughter, which actually is very destructive to authority. So we started to do a project which we called Conscious Misreading and Being Dead Seriously Silly, where we used an exhibition for Beirut and its condition to have been actually under war, to find or to choose, to try to find or to show them that the nurse architect, which was regarded to kind of repair the site again or repair the soldiers so that the fighting could go on, in itself would suddenly become hysterical and in itself actually would stop to function. the first conditions we did is that we exchanged all different types of representations of war, representation of medicine. We kind of misunderstood the idea of operation and tactics from the medical to the military condition, and proposed a kind of wrapping condition, the wrapping of the victims and different kind of new surfaces onto Beirut, which we then sent off to them. And where the misreadings of representations, as you can see to the left, there were different operational techniques overlaid with different other operational techniques. And on the right, you could see the reality of the site. But the misreadings started to create a formal project where surfaces, where the underlayer of the souks were just left totally as they were. And the proposal was to use new layers, wrapping layers, air rights, lower rights, and so on, in order to actually finance the individual souk area, which actually the individual owners have about a 3 by 3 meter site. Actually, I heard in Beirut right now they're just cleaning the site out again in order to do larger ownerships, in order to do real architecture. So it was, in that sense, the outcome, the formal outcome started to be also a structural alternative, in a sense of saying one could look at the city of the structure in a layered condition. The projects which went to Beirut, and there was a larger exhibition, I think got bombed actually, and later on we kind of got those models back, and we were rather aware that this model was in one sense an exhibition and a so-called work of art, and in another sense an hysterical argument from our side that it was an impossibility to actually answer that question, how to repair Beirut as an architect somewhere in at that point, Boston. What I do sometimes is, if I have some kind of outcomes from these experiments, I sometimes try to find out if they would in detail actually work. I was lucky enough to have a client who wanted to have a house, a new house. She wanted to rip down everything she had. And as we were just in the middle of doing this Beirut thing, we started like, what would happen if we just leave the stuff as it is and put a house on top of the house and wrap it in some kind of transparent new landscape, which then would have some comments to play upon the layers which were underneath, which actually is a building. It has a lot of interiors from a film director and a film guy who did Cleopatra. He designed Cleopatra and had all these kind of metaphors and myth figures in the interior. So in a sense, we then try to find out, could we do a more conservative tectonic translation of something which in itself started as an hysterical argument, in order to find out what relationships surface on construction could have. And that building was then developed where the layers of the lower and the upper layers were just kind of negotiated in a kind of tension-filled sometimes and sometimes symbiotic relationship. We achieved building permit for this building. The client decided after she got the permit to build the building in Spanish style because it was cheaper. And we declined. We thought that our experiment was over, and we didn't really necessarily want to work further with this. But we were permanently trying to find out if we do have information, map information, site information, in what sense we could create certain kinds of chorus singing in the process of doing things. And here, for example, we have the site in Berlin, where we started to collect. We started to be like obsessive collectors of representations of site. Here's one which we had from 1730s, the Berlin area of the Spreebogen, which you can see on the left, again, a typical tabula rasa situation after Second World War. We started to collect all the kind of information we got and made a technique available where we first collected all kinds of conditions, and then everybody started to reread the surfaces out of it. So they were like traces coming out of the group, where about 8 people were trying to do these kind of reading exercises. The interesting point there then was like how these things could be then further developed in a working model, in a kind of folding open, in a kind of 3-dimensionality. In what sense then the idea of transformative translation, which means at the moment you see things, right away as an author, you at the same time insert your pictures in it. But what we did is that every 8 hours, the documents would be rotated so that the pictures were like overlaid with the other person's pictures on a permanent basis. The outcome was visibly, even visibly, you could see that the last drawing was drawn by 4 different authors, and you can see a section somewhere. Let me just see where it is. For example, up here, where the lower representation and the upper one didn't fit. So there are actually kind of invisible lines in there where the logics, even in the last 5 minutes or in the last 24 hours, weren't necessarily 100% aligned, but where they were permanent as we were rotating border negotiations going on. And we sent that off as an unclear condition. When we started to go into the details, we started the different authors interwove their different kind of proposal as it was seen from the 3-dimensional foldings, and started to negotiate in what sense they could melt and weave as they were going along creating these kinds of plans. What we realized was that we were getting into something which was called thievery, designing as thievery, another technique which the feminists have talked about in terms of like the theory of text production. Claudine Herman called the female writer les voleuses du langue, the thieves of the language. This concept clarifies the new role of the author as an appropriator of existing patterns and sensations, a collector of found spatial conditions which then are used and transformed by the new author. Sisu, for example, in an interview said, "I found myself in the classic situation of women who at one time or another feel that it's not they who have produced culture. Culture was there, but it was a barrier forbidding me to enter, whereas of course from the depth of my body I had a desire for the objects of culture. I therefore found myself obliged to steal them." So that in a sense, culture is always there in her works, in her writing, but it's always there in a displaced, diverted, reversed way. I have always used it in a totally ironic way. The technique is the same for many members in the cultural industry. The legitimacy of their act is purely defined by their acceptance by high cultural circles. Anne Berggren, as you probably know, has also shown in her writings that in an ancient framework, the new author can use a metis, a technique, to kind of subvert things as the weaker in order to survive. So we started to think about how we could do culture as a cultural commentary, and at the same time wanted to use the idea of play and irony, scratch, doodle, and find out how we could work with it within given frameworks. So this one, for example, was a rather interesting one, which was very consciously chosen as a basic framework, the National Library of Copenhagen. It was chosen because of many situations. Copenhagen is a typical Nordic, Northern Sea, Nordic country who always thought for many, many hundred years that high culture had to be stolen from the south. So they, for example, stole the plan of this library from Munich, where Munich actually stole their plan from Florence. So the idea of a perfect, a proper Beaux-Arts plan kind of traveled and got distorted from kind of city to city as it kind of wandered northwards and as it wandered backwards in time. So here, the author had an interesting situation. You see on the right the given site. I don't know, you don't have, that's how I can do it. The given site, and up there, this thing is actually a kind of distorted, perfect Beaux-Arts plan, which the author has worked on for quite a while without knowing what the site was. But the author ended having that specific frame building up there in their way. The architect was called Hansen. And so what he had to do, which you can see here nicely, press that one, okay, is that he had actually a Viking harbor with a this one doesn't really work very well then. Batteries are out. I can do it like that. With he had this perfect plan, which actually was bilateral. It was a double cross. And suddenly he got a site where a Viking building was right in the middle of it. So he had to, it destroyed his Beaux-Arts plan. And it was in 1904. There was crisis, there was new nationalism going on. And it was, it's a time, a historical time I'm very, very interested in, specifically in the Scandinavian countries, and when that early modernism started to occur. Because what happens, you can see here, was it was a kind of a cut and collect situation where you had, in the middle he had a medieval building, on the left he had a French library room, on the right he had a Viking basement area, and down there he still had the rest of the perfect Beaux-Arts plan. But things didn't really work out very well for that author, or rather worked out very well because it was the first attempt for a so-called national building, National Library, Royal Library, and it ended to have rather interesting nationalistic referencing, trying to find a culture for the Nordic countries, which up to then only copied classicism from the south. And so our first commentary on the situation is, if you need 100% extension, we will steal the author's problems of national representation, copy it, distort it according to, on the computer, distorting according to the given new site, and luckily we just had 100% expansion, and then make interpretations of and rotations of those different elements which we used in order to find a blind twin, a twin which comments on the specific accidents which happen. You can see it on the upper area where you can see the kind of plan accidents happen in the École des Beaux-Arts plan. We were commenting on it and finding the qualities of those kinds of attempt of national expression. Besides that, there were some other conditions, which here was the concert hall, which was in a second competition later on, and here you can see the site plan of the new library condition. Oops. In the distortion plan, it happened that everything got distorted, and so we had these elements which in themselves were read from the existing plan, but since some of them started to tilt, we had these kinds of cuts which actually were very practical. The two tilts here gave us a non-axial entrance to the library, which here you have the tilted book wall in the entrance area, and the tilt towards the water gave us actually some kind of floating balconies in order to provide, I don't know, a zilch of departments, of reading departments, which you can see on the right. And so there was this internal ramp landscape where you could kind of permanently go through this tilted book wall, which was the heavy one, and then actually arrive at all of these different reading balconies independently. But when you were in the space, you had them actually all together. And those platforms were all used in order to make our interpretations of those kinds of found structures which we found in the interpretation of the precedents. The second attempt, which was important, had to do with surface and look. And as we were kind of copying and stretching and going back and forth, and we started to get into a mode of which we call copy and drag, we used the imagery of the upper area here, the copper roof landscape, which you can see all there, and which is rather famous, and pulled it down to the water and copied it as we were going and stretching it along the copy machine, which actually gave us the new elevation of that new library. There was a huge fight going on in Copenhagen. Sorry, I did the wrong thing here. Who is supposed to win? And we unfortunately got only second prize. It was very close, and it was interesting because the two parties fought. The Social Democrats, with a female cultural minister, thought that it was the most amazing national representation they could ever imagine, where the conservative mayor, who had one more vote, insisted that it was a militant feminist animal. He called it an animal, and that it would go over his dead body to be in the city. And so we lost. But this kind of idea of found object and copying and tracing was right away kind of utilized again. We appropriated it as we were working and something for a kind of actually a real project again. Those are the only ones we're doing on the site where we kind of get into the materiality of things, where we used an Airstream trailer, and you probably know how these look like, and went into like how trailers is being used and did a kind of a nasty misreading of the lower class condition for a very upper class family who wanted to have a guest house for their one grandchild. So we kind of found a trailer and then started to wrap and copy the condition of the trailer into a process of traces and rotations, which then were in themselves regarded as a parking structure, which was fine with the building department since it was just a porte cochere. And when you pushed the trailer in, it started to be with a loft bed, a kind of a double structure for guests. And so it was then, and it was a temporary condition, so it was built for about a couple of years and then removed. Some of the kind of things of copies and traces and foldings which came from there ended up actually in a strange structure, which he has photographed at a storefront, which was from that trailer object where we had to unfold all these different things because the space was so small, and ended up as a kind of prototype for something hanging on the wall, which actually was a table for about 9 people. That one is luckily still used. In that commentary, just to go back to this found condition and copying, we also in the Copenhagen competition did something which we called the loser project. Copenhagen at that point had a huge fight with the NATO. We stole one of NATO's boats, and that was our loser project, which we also had in the Copenhagen competition. Cut it open, put the relationship to it, and then kind of copied back and forth within the boat the new National Library. And they actually insisted it never arrived. I guess it was not something to their liking. So we had a true loser project in there too, where we had the same kind of idea of appropriation and commentary. In that sense, I'd like to kind of go to some of my last 2 projects, which have to do with parody, disguise, and carnival, in a sense where we started to read something which I think was very much called feminist science fiction writers. And you probably know many of them, where the writing was used in order to comment on the future or certain kinds of possibilities which would happen. This project here is actually the Shinkanchiku membrane competition. I think it was called Superstructure Working. You know, they have all these kind of big names. It doesn't mean a lot, but we actually used it to comment on the overall infrastructural space of Los Angeles, used the highway area, and used a report by Edison, which is the national electrical company. They're trying to take over General Motors by insisting on producing 60 to 70% electrical cars until 2005. There's a whole new reality going on, which we thought would be pretty interesting. And so we went and investigated what actually would happen in terms of real estate and what we could do in terms of public space if we would propose, which the electric company is trying to push through, that all freeways and highways in LA have to be electrified and only electrical vehicles can drive on them and directly get their electrical access to it, so they would have not that battery problem and so on. And also there was the typical American idea of incentives, right? I mean, because everybody else has to go the slow roads now, they're going to go and buy the electrical cars, and Edison's going to make a good profit. So we thought it was kind of an interesting idea that suddenly all public space would go back onto the edge of the highway. We proposed a new idea of agriculture, high-tech agriculture, and high-density conditions where we kind of pushed all those kinds of structures of the neighborhoods, which all died out, proposed that the state should buy them all up right now, because right now all the real estate along the highway is incredibly low, and then reconsider the development of new city developments along something which we call string structures, which is very apparent in LA. And we kind of had, it was kind of, these competitions were there for us in order to investigate new sections. And here we talked about something which we call the new office landscape, which means landscape not in the modernist sense, again, as passive, as a pure visual backdrop, was then transformed into full production entities for strawberries and flowers and all these things which actually have to go under membranes, we used then the membrane structure in order to find passive energy for the so-called offices around there, and found like a new tense kind of, or dense sections between the now calm, non-polluting highways and a new kind of more dense edge structures. In that sense, I think I want to kind of end with what I'm working on right now, which goes back to this notion which I find rather interesting in terms of, well, in one another way, question the precedents and the conditions of authorship. We started a lot to go with something which we call drag and copy, rotate, use conditions which we find, where there are many reasons why we may find them. The thing we got pretty interested in was Chinese gardens, and that was already a year ago. We just kind of got interested in it, specifically because some of the theoreticians talked about that China has some kind of interesting, how should I say right now, magnetic field in the intellectual world, because some of them are fascinated by it nearly like in an imperialistic way, in a sense that it's a market, it has to be conquered, and there's stuff out there. But China, in her case, Kristeva has written a book on Chinese women, and China, she got interested in this idea that we always say, this sounds Chinese to me, which means there was always an other, a kind of a condition, a fantasy, which in itself had other realities, which at the same time we were aware of, we had no idea of. So we got interested in two things. One was the Chinese obsession of rocks and mountains, and they sacred, and rocks became the most sublime work of art. To find the perfect rock was more important than to create the perfect sculpture. And the rocks were exhibited all around the palaces, and the rocks were kind of altered so that the taste for drama in the rocks could be considered even more sublime than what it already was. They then invented diving structure, diving like 2,000 years before Christ, in order to get these very precise rocks in a very precise lake, because those were the most dramatic. And we were also interested in conditions and gardens which were called garden of networks, or where networks and public space were overlapped. And so we kind of thought this was something we just wanted to dive into. We started to scan. I mean, we started to use more the computers. We started to use the computers in the Copenhagen. Since then, we kind of rather computerized, actually. We started to scan, copy, and alter what we found from, for example, one condition of a weird kind of path of place and dynamic, and commented upon those kinds of found structures as we found them, by then kind of editing them out as we went along. At the same time, we got very, very interested in the rock carving, the idea of drama in the stone itself, and how the stone had to be nearly altered in order to be sublime. And so we started to carve rocks, which also at the same time were called mountains, as we were going on in this project, in order to find a way to actually start to show well, we were asked to do a city part in Shanghai, and we thought that whole thing pretty absurd. So we didn't know Shanghai, but here's the outcome of that exercise, where the layerings of path systems were all kind of interwoven into each other. There was an internal landscape proposed, which in itself created huge gaps and high densities, and conditions or locations of the sacred mountains around Shanghai were copied into conditions and just localities within the site, which in itself was actually an abstract site. We realized there's nothing serious about that specific competition. I mean, it's not supposedly to be built. But the thing we got very much interested in is how we then, as different authors, started to copy the rocks and reconsider how they would then embed themselves into the three-dimensional landscape. So the rocks which were found, because we found them in representations, were then still back embedded in the found kind of maps and plans as you found, and where then we kind of realized we could find other architectural conditions of external public space, for example, internal wrappings and double loops and things which we learned from the Chinese rock carving. The projects are just started to be produced, so this is kind of that's what we're doing right at this second, which means we're not doing anything since I'm standing here. But there were then specific kind of, again, transformational modes where people were shifting in the computer. I mean, it's difficult, but you have to know the program pretty well, and carved, you know, from stone to stone, copied one stone over, then went back, got into a fight, and started to embed them into the locations. And then at the end, they all became friends again and proposed this project. Thanks. Questions?
Ask you the first question as a sort of warm-up, but I think it would be in terms of the discussion of the translation that comes from copy that you were talking about, and for example in terms of the reference to the library,
Right.
and the explanation that there has in fact been a kind of history of these kinds of transformations where the whole notion of authenticity itself begins to be questioned. What I think would be very interesting is at what point in the procedure, in the processes that you're developing, do you also create certain moments of interruption where you can look at what you have in the project? So the idea of the copy of the new library itself now at some point in its moment of formation begins to be a new library. In other words, it has a status as something that is different from what was. So the repercussions or the implications of that difference, how are they tested in the projects?
It depends.
Like how is this library different from other libraries and so on? I think.
How is it different from other libraries?
Because I think when you make an idea of a copy, then by definition you end up with something that, whether you like it or not, it's something that's new. And that newness, that thing that is new, already now operates somehow differently in terms of its use in relation to the history of that. Of that object.
I mean, it's clear that it doesn't end up as a copy, as a twin, as a second. The only important part which we were interested in is the first step. I mean, the first step in a sense of that you have either the pressure of pure invention, which very often one resorts to either typology pre-given or geometry pre-given, or geometrical arguments, either deconstructed or constructed, depending on what the ideology is. But when you start with a precedence which in itself is loaded, which means it's loaded because of the history, what it already carries with it, it has a network of arguments already embedded, because it's not just that specific copy. That copy has already embedded like 4 other copies in front of it. So it becomes different at the moment it's been copied. For example, just because we decided to put the 150 button because we need to stretch it. Certainly already there we decided that we're doing also an aesthetic choice because we like dynamics more than stasis. So the static square of the cross was right away, distributed throughout the site, which was a given. But we realized that the group just made an aesthetic choice that they liked the elongation. But then, at that point, I think what makes it interesting is that it becomes fluid, which means the difference, the status of difference, is there from day to day to day, which means every day the difference starts to be created within the discourse of specific localities, conditions, frameworks, programs, goals, criticisms of the individual authors in the group. For example, like when there's a reading room, which there was before, which in itself was actually the interior was copied from the French library, National Library. The exterior was copied, was the medieval building, because it was a precondition. Then that person had like a referencing system in which that person could discuss a lot of issues. At the same time, being confronted with that it needs to be a reading space for Department 1A. So there were absurdities happening, and then there were givens happening, and then there were interpretations happening. And the importance is just that the basis of authorship was not in the first step of invention, but was in the step of choice and editing, in a sense that, and so I do not deny that there's not an authorship. There's an incredible active authorship going on all the time, but it becomes a kind of process-oriented authorship of tinkering. We called it tinkering, for example. So.
What generally is the difference in between inventing and evaluation or changing? I don't really see the difference between this.
I think it's a big difference. In invention, for example, the basis of many architectural projects which we were confronted with are based on a certain kind of hygiene condition of a pureness and a pure modernist specifically, if you think about, even if it doesn't necessarily have to do with the skyscrapers in Central City, or even with the plan, as in Copenhagen was this perfect accident. The pureness of the cross of the plan, the geometry which it was referring to, was regarded as a high cultural, as the invention, which means it was a kind of a, it was regarded as an aggression against landscape as being non-cultured, female, vessel, not loaded, where the imposition of a pure figure, for example, geometry, or the first act of imposition, was a different one than using the material in front of you where you tinker. Partly it has to do with the ideologies that there is a higher possibility of participation, because it's not a pre-given. The thing kind of roll more, they fluid in the process.
But I mean, then that means that your whole discourse doesn't really, isn't really concerned with what's happening right now, but rather with what has happened back 100 years ago. I mean, because you're just talking about this other building and the hygienic of that other building and the wilderness of feminist wilderness of the countryside, whereas nowadays, I mean, buildings, no one, even without arguing the way you do, or not all people come up with these hygienic buildings. I don't really see what you're referring at as counterpart.
I think it has something to do with the concept. I mean, see, that's the problem. It has nothing to do with formalism, how they look like. It has something to do with how they get produced. Because what we're very much interested in is the sociological and political definition of that authorship. We're less interested in actually what stylistic condition comes out of it.
Yeah, but that's exactly it. I mean, the authorship concept, or embodies my prize, is not, or as far as I see it, it's nothing new. It's just another way of, it's just another argumentation. And it doesn't, it's an argumentation which is basically based on this feminist, I am feminist, and let's just, give names to all the groups, minorities, whereas nowadays everyone is a minority.
Right. I find your argument actually you're just blabbing in a certain sense. I don't really know where your point is. So why are you getting so aggressive?
What is the big difference in between, I mean, what nowadays is big difference, for example, between this feminist approach and a masculine heterosexual approach?
See, I think you may have not gotten the first point in that's why I did an introduction, that difference has already been eradicated. That's already not, it's not an interesting, because the interesting part has to do with the political definition of authorship per se. It has nothing, it's just that the feminist theoreticians just helped to break that idea up. Now, in your case, you just go, there's nothing new. Well, see, that's exactly the point. The whole point is that the production of novelties has become entirely uninteresting. And now he sits again and says, I want to be entertained. I want to have new. There's nothing new. I find it a totally uninteresting argument.
And I find it totally uninteresting arguments. It just assemble a few notions of, well, let's introduce this term, introduce that term, blah, blah, here around, twist this, and give all these different things everyone does in architecture anyhow, just with a nice name, and put them off and nothing. I don't see the basic argumentation underlying it.
I must admit that your argument is not very well founded. I mean, you just kind of, oh, well, just that, oh, well, that, just, yeah. If you have it would be good if you could come up with something which in itself would maybe argue for an alternative. There was somebody over there first, though.
I have two questions. The first one is, was it the process you implied when reading the
I didn't. That was the important part. The important part with the rock carving is that nature was produced ideologically. It was not. It was altered. The culture, the Chinese culture, where we looked at those rocks, all the rocks were created in order to be better rocks than the ones which existed. So they had to go to specific places in order to heighten the dynamic of the found rock, and then had to alter the rock in order to represent the cultural goal, that rock in itself became sublime. That's what was the interesting part, not that we were copying nature. That was uninteresting. The way that people had to work on the rock in order to make it a better rock was the interesting part.
For the first question, how did you read the surface?
Depending on how did you read what surface?
In one of your projects, you had the plan of Beirut, and you started reading the surface and the textures, what's happening there. So, how is that reading or the decoding of the messages that human perceive from such a plan?
Right. Well, there were the surfaces which we were inserting from that reading was not surfaces which we read out of Beirut. We just left Beirut as it was. The surfaces which we read were from other representations, for example, the medical representations of Beirut or the military representations of Beirut. So those were kind of misread and used as a text in the process, but not like traces or plans or maps of Beirut itself. Is this It will be questionable. I think there's a major change, but I would not support the argument that craft has something to do with it. In a sense, when authorship was questioned in the first round, it was questioned because one wanted to resort back to craft as a basis of making, and that in itself had a representation of guilds or whatever they called in English. I mean, kind of craft groups, which in themselves always worked as an already established social group of authors, for example, in crafts, whatever, masters of so-and-so. Nowadays, that questioning of authorship becomes a much more theoretical one. And also, I guess what it becomes, what we realize right now, it becomes a legal one. And they will melt, which doesn't mean that authorship will not exist, but that the kind of urge for kind of a singularity of representation of form may not be so strong in the future. I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, but it may not be as strong as it has been happening in the last 10 years, where it became a kind of a rock concert fashion situation. In a sense that, for example, in Germany specifically, the style of these authors were then shopped as shopping mall, kind of supermarket conditions, so that you had to have in the city, you know, a Chanel boutique and a Richard Meier museum. So it was kind of started to be a very specific way of shopping. I think that one starts to be rather crumbling, but that is a much more theoretical condition. And it will not resort back to craft as a basis of production. I don't think so. There's a big difference, I would say.
Do you think it's men who want to have their names on buildings and that women might take a more reasonable approach?
No, I don't think that. I think it has, as I said, I think that the feminists I'm mostly interested in have the most ambivalent or rather often hateful relationship to the definition of biologically defined feminism, which means that feminism has something to do with women. And I need maybe to underline that one more time. Those specific feminists are only interested in the establishment of authorship per se in Western culture. It happened to be men, and it happened therefore to break up now because there's this whole idea that modernism had something to do with enlightenment and emancipation. And since it was the basis of emancipation, it deconstructed itself. So modernism has actually deconstructed itself in its own understanding of authorship. It's just a fact. And therefore, it becomes interesting how to write, not because you're female. It makes it just more fun, I guess, because many females haven't done it before, right? So they are allowed maybe to write, but it doesn't make it, for example, it doesn't make them more prone to it, more better to it, more engaged in it, or any of that. It's just like, it has nothing to do with that kind of biologically defined feminism. It has only to do with the act of writing, and like how you actually, and how much myth hangs behind it, how much myth is behind the idea of invention, in what sense they are helpful, or in what sense they can be, regarded critically. Okay, thanks.